Good morning, everyone. I have a significant internet problem here, so please forgive me. I'm doing my best to speak via my phone. Can someone just show me they can hear me? Give a thumbs up or the like. Perfect. Okay, so I'm trying to do this via my phone. I apologize that we'll see how the technology works. So we were looking at the issue of belief, the Ikrim, the fundamentals of faith, the view of the Rambam, that there are fundamentals of faith, that one has to believe certain things in order to be an upstanding member of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. The Rambam talks about this affecting one's chelek in olam haba, one's portion in the world to come. Someone wrote me a text off group, which I promised to address at the start of this today's session, and with great pain, they wrote to me saying this whole discussion is so deeply disturbing. Why should we be engaged in this endeavor of trying to work out who does or who doesn't have a portion in the world to come? The whole concept of heresy and defining people as apikorasim and minim and kofrim, and the whole terminology used just seems so profoundly un-Jewish. It doesn't seem to be the way that we look at things. Surely it's not our role and not our position to judge people in this way. And how are we meant to make sense of this? This is such a troubling and difficult topic. So I promised I would address it at the beginning of the shir, because this is the purpose of this mini series that we're looking at: the idea of belief, the idea of heresy. Kefira, I started this discussion in response to questions that were asked of me, because we were talking about olam haba in the world to come. So I was asked, what is the place of non-believers, and we'll hopefully get up to in this shir also, in the place of non-Jews in this context of this discussion. So the first thing I would say to this person who asked me this question is it's a great question. In a sense, this is the purpose of this little mini series. I am trying to address the pain behind this question, because there's no use not acknowledging the fact that there are difficult things in our sources about all sorts of matters. And included in the difficult things in our sources is this concept of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, the 13 principles of faith, and trying to sort it out in our minds, trying to make sense of it. More than that, the very figure who introduced this is the great Rambam. And it's an interesting fact that the Rambam, who in so many respects broadened so much Jewish discussion, in this particular context sets very firm parameters in place. And this is something that does make many of us uncomfortable when we read it. But the Rambam set these parameters in place, and a lot of discussion has developed around this. Why was it the Rambam of all people that did this? Surely we would have expected perhaps thinkers who didn't have the same breadth of ideas and thoughts as the Rambam to have been those who introduced and really worked and developed on this concept. Why was it the Rambam of all people that did this? Of course, as I've tried to share in the last couple of weeks, some of the root ideas are found in the Gemara already. It does talk about certain beliefs that affect whether one does or doesn't have a portion in the world to come, but in a far more limited way. The Mishnah talks about it in the Mishnah Chelek, which is really the chapter of Mishnayos that the Rambam introduces his concept to. Nonetheless, the Rambam is certainly the one that developed this most fully and built out of this whole sort of theological system. So why is it that the Rambam who did it? We don't know really the answer, but possibly it's because the same Rambam who broadened the discussion therefore felt there was a danger and a need to set its parameters. In other words, one can only have a breadth of discussion, as the Rambam does in his Guide to the Perplexed, in his Moed Nevuchim, and so many of his works, in which he opens up so many possibilities and explores so many options. So perhaps this is the same reason why the Rambam had to very firmly set a line in the sands and say, Ad kan v'sulo, up to here, but no further. There are things which even I would acknowledge are outside and beyond the pale. But nonetheless, what do we make all of this? Why is it for us humans to determine these things? And the truth is, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, right when we started looking at the Yud Gimel Ikrim, that the Rambam's views aroused a lot of controversy. There were those who said who chose these 13 at all, or who agrees with the very idea of Ikrim. The Abarbanel and others who belong very much to the rationalist school of thought, as does the Rambam, and even those in subsequent generations of the Rambam who followed the concept of Ikrim, such as the Sefer HaIkrim, the Spanish work, whose very title is the Book of Principles, the Book of Principles of Faith, didn't agree with the Rambam's categorization. Some of them argued that everything in the Torah is what a Jew is meant to believe. If a Jew is meant to believe it, they're meant to believe it. This is what a Jew is meant to believe. Others said, well, surely it depends on whether one is shogeg or mazid. If someone deliberately and consciously is rejecting Jewish faith and Jewish tradition, then I understand the idea of saying they have excluded themselves from the community. However, if someone is a member of the community, if someone innocently and inadvertently doesn't realize that something is a belief, why should this be considered an ikar emunah? Why should this be a principle of faith which excludes someone from the class of participants in the world to come, excludes them from the path of being part of the Jewish community? So the Rambam himself, in his own lifetime and afterwards, was attacked for this thesis of what we call nebuch apikoros, someone who inadvertently, in the language of Chaim Brisker, the Yiddish phrase of Chaim Brisker, in explaining the Rambam, someone who innocently and inadvertently ends up with a belief which isn't in line with the basic premises of Judaism. So this question is not a new question. The pain at the view of the Rambam is something that was felt by the critics of the Rambam, the Rivers, who we saw, who said Rabbi Avraham ben David, the provincial scholar, who says that about the Rambam's view that someone who doesn't understand that God is without a body, he says many people made a mistake about this matter because they took the language of the Torah, the language of Medrash literally, and they took an anthropomorphic view. They took a view that Hashem has a morphology, a body of a human being, or some bodily parts in some shape or form. He said these are Rabbi Matovim Manu. These are perhaps people who are greater and bigger than the Rambam himself, better than the Rambam himself. So who is it for the Rambam to determine that these people are apikosim? So this question is this pain is not a new one. It's something that was implicit already in the writings of the Rambam and something that disturbed his critics. On the other hand, what is the alternative? After all, surely there must be some outline that sets the parameters of what we mean by belief in Judaism. There has to be some limits. If someone, through no fault of their own, has a belief system completely in contrast with Judaism, if someone is a polytheist who doesn't believe in Moshe, doesn't believe in the Torah, doesn't believe in a single God, but says, I'm Jewish, and genuinely and sincerely means that, and is passionately involved in what they see as Judaism, but has absolutely no idea what Judaism means, through no fault of their own. The classic nebuch apikoros, this in the formulation of Chaim Brisker, this person who really doesn't understand through no fault of their own. But there has to come a point where we say, listen, this is nice that you are sincere and passionate about this, but what you're describing is quite simply not Judaism. What you're describing is quite simply another faith. And we can dream up the examples plenty. At what point does it indeed happen that we will turn to someone and say what you're believing is well meant and innocently ascribed to, but nonetheless it simply isn't Judaism? And there's a lot of discussion around this from a philosophical or halachic basis, as we're engaging in now, but on a very pragmatic basis. What are the limits of this? What are the parameters of this? This is discussed in the context of the law of return in the state of Israel. At what point does someone who maybe is halachically Jewish but has adopted the views of another faith? There's discussions about Jews for J and the parameters around that. At what point do we say to someone, this isn't a question of blame, but this quite simply isn't Judaism that you are ascribing to? So it's the counterclaim, the claim that the Rambam would make is, it's nice coming along and saying, look, who are we to set parameters, and why should we be making these judgment calls? But what are the limits of this, and how far are we going to take this? So this is the discussion the Rambam started, as he did with so many other discussions, and the ideas behind it are definitely ones that can make us uncomfortable. There are aspects of this that make me deeply uncomfortable, but I don't think there's a point in us not acknowledging what the Rambam said and trying to address it. I would say, by the way, I've put everyone on mute as per the normal structure, but please feel free to unmute yourself to ask anything. Because of the setup this week, I'm not going to find it easy to see chat. My phone, I have to sort of switch, swipe the screen a few times sideways in order to get to the chat. So if you do want to ask something, don't assume that I'll see it in the chat this week. So this is the view of the Rambam. Personally, what I find particularly difficult in the Rambam is that if we take the Rambam, as far as I understand, to its logical conclusion, again, let's avoid the issue of someone who innocently is making mistakes. But someone who falls in the category of someone who's decided to reject a certain belief, including someone who does so sincerely, but is aware of the choice they are making. If they believe in 12 out of the 13 principles, but they are missing the 13th, so they believe in God, they believe in Torah and Hashemaim, but they don't believe in Tchias HaMesim, the revival of the dead. According to the Rambam, it would appear that they are simply outside the category of believers, in the same way as someone who is a polytheist who doesn't believe in a monotheistic God. The implications of this are very difficult, but this is what the Rambam Maimonides says. I tried to explain in last week's shir that there is a balance to be found here in line with the classic Jewish distinction, which distinguishes between the chota and the chet, the sinner and the sin. However, its application is not that simple in this particular case. The background to this language of chota and chet is a story involving Rabbi Meir and his wife Gloria, in which there are various scoundrels and thugs in the area and the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir who make his life an absolute misery, and in desperation he davens to Hashem that Hashem should destroy them, he can't handle this anymore. And his wife Gloria tells him off and says that's not the way you should daven. The pasuk says Yitamu Chatzorim min ha'aretz, sin should cease from the land, and not Yitamu Chotim, sinners shouldn't cease from the land. We're not meant to pray for the demise or the finishing off, the cessation of the sinners. We're meant to pray for the demise of the sin. However, the Rambam here is explaining that this classic distinction doesn't work so simply in this case, because the Rambam is of the view that this isn't about guilt, this is about a sort of existential reality. If one doesn't believe in a certain set of beliefs, then one just simply isn't connecting in a way which allows one to have a spiritual existence. This is very much a Rambam view, of course. The Rambam believes that ideas and philosophical thoughts are what defines, or at least one's most fundamental route to spiritual connection. This is what the Rambam is saying over here. Those who adopt a view that it's more about actions, it's more about ma'asim and deeds, maybe would disagree with the Rambam. They would say it depends on what you do rather than what your beliefs are. But either way, both schools of thought agree, and this is what we tried to discuss when we spoke about Olam Haba, both agree that spiritual existence is an existential reality. It's not just an awarding of a prize for successful life. It's the reality one has built of oneself, which is the spiritual existence, the degree to which one has molded oneself into a spiritual being, an ethical being, a moral being, a mitzvah observing being, an intellectual being, however one chooses to formulate it, based upon one's where one belongs on the divide between the Rambam and the Kabbalists. But everyone agrees it's about what you've made of yourself. And therefore, if someone, let's take a counterexample, if someone hasn't developed themselves ethically at all, and they remain an unethical person with no moral development and sensibility, through no fault of their own, but that's just who they are, then they will simply existentially be that sort of person. They will be a person who has a very poor moral inner life. And therefore, it would be difficult to see in what sense they have a spiritual existence. And the Rambam, in his own worldview, is taking this to include intellectual development. And the normal, therefore, distinction we would draw between the failed individual and their failure isn't such a simple one. Nonetheless, the Rambam, as we saw, also acknowledges the concept of a tzedek shenishba, someone who has grown up completely unaware or oblivious to these ideas. And what we saw last week was the extension by the later authorities of this concept of tzedek shenishba, which the Rambam introduces in the setting of the Sadducees, the Tzaddokim, who he says the first generation fall in the category of heretics, but the later generations are simply cast as tzedek shenishba, as children who were captured, who never developed a more sophisticated understanding and therefore can't be classed as heretics. And we saw how this was extended by Reb David Hoffman in early 1900s Germany, extended by the Chazon Ish in the pre and post independence Israel, and extended by Rav Kook, by Rav Avad Yosef, by Rav Amital, the Rosh Hashiva of Gush, and various other, by Rav Shlomo Goren, by various other later thinkers. So an attempt to sort of resolve the absolutist objective formulation of the ideas of Kefira with a subjective, more personalized understanding of people's journeys is what is this concept of Tzimik Shenishma. But to easily remove the halachic categorization of the Rambam completely is not one that we can is one that we can't do. It's there within the classic sources of halachic literature. So this is a little bit of background of this, and therefore I acknowledge, in a sense, the difficulty, the question that was asked to me about how disturbing some of these ideas are. They are disturbing, but they are there in our sources, and we need to grapple with them and try and make some sense of them. However, having said that, as I said, the consensus of poskim as we enter the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century is that the reality is, halacha acknowledges we live in a complex and often unclear spiritual world, and therefore it's understood that the application of this Rambam to modern life would be incorrect, and therefore we would assume that anyone who doesn't fall in the classic category of a ma'amin, a believer in the thinking of the Rambam, would fall under the category of a tzimik shenishba, of someone who is a non-believer due to genuinely and sincerely held views which have never properly considered the alternative from within our system, and therefore wouldn't qualify as a kofar, wouldn't qualify as a heretic. And we also saw the reason of Rav Shlomo Goren, who argues that the view of the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah is that it's only someone who declares with certainty disbelief, as opposed to someone who has doubts and is going on a spiritual journey. I was asked incidentally about this idea that the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah is backing off from what he says in his commentary to Mishnayos, where he lists the 13 principles of faith, and there seems to say that one has to have a definite belief, as opposed to saying that as long as one doesn't definitely declare the opposite way around, one would count as a kofar, as a heretic. Rav Shlomo Goren, I think, correctly points this out as a diuk, as a nuance in the language of the Rambam. The Rambam in the Mishnah Torah seems to be clear. It is not one who says, I have doubts, who counts as a heretic, but one who declares confidently that I don't believe in one God or whatever it may be, who counts as a heretic. And even then, as we said, if someone is a tzimik shenishba, someone who has grown up in today's a-spiritual world, in the world in which we struggle with spirituality, the contemporary poskim do not believe such a person falls under the category of the Rambam. So what we have here is a Rambam who says, who speaks about belief and the concept of principles of faith, and a poskim, certainly in modern times, where faith is not so easy to come by, who have tried to soften this by widening and broadening the category of tzimik shenishba, which the Rambam introduced, but by applying it much further. Halacha l'maisa, in practical terms, therefore, according to these poskim, every single non-believer nowadays, or almost every single non-believer, would fall under the category of a tzimik shenishba, because we live in a world in which arriving at spiritual insight is difficult and a struggle. What are we meant to make of the fact that the Rambam changed his formulation between his Heresy HaMishnayos, his commentary on the Mishnayos, and his Mishnah Torah, his halachic work? How are we meant to make sense of the idea that in his Mishnah Torah he seems to imply that anyone who doesn't believe with certainty is a heretic, in his halachic work he seems to say that it's only those who are confident in asserting not disbelief who come under the category of heretics? 2 points to mention. The first is The version that we have of this commentary to Mishnah is originally in Arabic, and we'd have to check the nuance of what he's actually writing in the Hebrew to be certain, whereas his Mishnah Torah is his Hebrew version. Secondly, his Mishnah Torah was written some 2 decades after his commentary to Mishnah, and the Rambam changed his mind on occasion. Someone pointed out to me the works of the great Meshech Chochmah, Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, who was obviously an expert in the Rambam and dedicated a lot of his career and his learning and his writing to the Rambam. He writes that all the works of the Rambam, whether the Mishnah Torah, the Perush Mishnayos, his commentary on Mishnayos, or his Moreh Nevuchim, his guide to the Perplexed, all have one ruach in them. They all have one spirit to them. They all share one basic worldview, and this is no doubt the case. The Rambam was not 3 different figures, despite the ostensible differences between his Mishnah Torah and his Moreh Nevuchim. There's a common thread that runs through them. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that it's identical. The Rambam, like any other human being, developed over time and changed his mind sometimes. And we have several hundred instances or examples in which the Rambam changes his mind between his Mishnah Torah, his commentary on Mishnah Torah, which he wrote 20 years or so after his commentary to, his Mishnah Torah, his halakhic work, which he wrote 20 years after his commentary to the Mishnah, and this would appear to possibly be another example of that. So this is what I really wanted to say on in the discussion of the Ikrim, the principles of faith in terms of Jewish believers and disbelievers. In a moment, I want to talk about the non-Jewish place in the world to come. But and again, I don't promise comfortable listening. But I think it's important for us to engage seriously with what the Rambam had to say on the matter. I'll just tell you briefly a story. There is I'm going to slightly blur the edges of the story just for interest of confidentiality. But there is in America a very large movement of right-wing Christian friends of Israel, many of whom are deeply religious, very seriously engaged with the Noahide commandments, or with the mitzvahs in what they call the Old Testament, what we would call the Torah, and these are people that are very strong and firm supporters of the state of Israel, and try and engage very seriously with what they see as their halachic obligation. In the UK, these groups are much smaller. There's very few of them, but there is such a group around. There are such individuals around. And through a series of events, I became effectively connected to one of them. One of them treats me as their rabbi. And they have a sort of email group with about 130 people scattered around the UK who try and engage seriously with halacha in their own understanding, and sometimes ask me halachic questions. A very fascinating experience. Many of them live in very isolated regions, quite far north in Scotland or in Wales and so on. And very religious Christians and strong friends of Israel. And I get questions about halachic matters which are quite difficult to answer, given that the questioner, from our point of view, is not obligated in mitzvahs at all. Now, on one particular occasion, someone who lives out in a very remote region had a white witch move to their area. Those of you who followed the news around Stonehenge and the like will know that there is a little bit of a revival of druid magic and white witchcraft and the like. And there's a small group of pagans, neo-pagans, and so on, who engage in religious practices. And they wrote to me saying that a white witch had moved to their island. They lived on a fairly remote island. A white witch had moved to the island, and they asked me to pray for the death of this individual. So I wrote back, quoting the pasuk, Yitamu Chatoim V'lo Chotim, the story of Rabbi Meir. And I said, look, in our tradition, we don't pray for the death of sinners, we pray for the cessation of sin rather than the death of sinners. Anyways, they wrote to their group of fellow travelers, fellow believers, that the rabbi had paskened that they should withdraw this request for the prayer for the death of this white witch, and they should instead daven for the cessation of the sin rather than the sinner. And they wrote to me a few weeks later saying that she had decided to move off the island, and they ascribed this to the power of our prayers. So who knows the story? So that's one for the Art Scroll book one day anyway. If anyone is keeping a record of these successful prayers. So this is the concept of Yitamu Chatoim V'lo Chotim. moving on from the issue of Maminim, Yudkim and Ikrim in terms of Jews, I want to talk about the status of non-Jews in this setting. Before I do so, I'll just pause. I don't know if anyone has any questions. As I said, I'm not easily able to see the, let me see if I can see the chat up. Okay, so we're okay with that. Okay, so I'll just try and talk then for a few minutes about the status of non-Jews in halacha. Now, the Rambam addresses this in his Mishnah Torah, and the point of departure, the context where he talks about this, is in Hilchos Melachim. Now, the very final sections of the Mishnah Torah deal with our relationship, Hilchos Melachim, the role of kings and government authority in halacha. He talks there about Moshiach. He talks there about belief in the ultimate king, King Moshiach. He also there speaks about, in the Jewish state, what would be the status of non-Jews. Had I been on my computer, I'd have wanted to share screen with everyone to show you to show us inside the next source. I'm not able to do so because I'm using my phone. However, the Rambam in the 8th chapter of Hilchos Melachim, have a look there, he speaks about the concept of ger toshav. So we're familiar with the idea of a ger tzedek, that is someone who decides to become part of the Jewish people and become a full member of the Jewish people, a ger tzedek. However, there's a second status of a ger toshav. A ger toshav is someone who accepts upon themselves to keep the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments. And the Rambam there discusses the fact that such a person is entitled to live in Eretz Yisrael and be a member of our country, a member of our state. Meaning to say that Eretz Yisrael, it's not only the place of residence for Jews, it can also be a place of residence and citizenship for non-Jews. However, as you would expect from any citizen of a country, there's basic laws that they need to accept. If you wish to come and live in England, then you need to accept the English system of government, whatever the British values, whatever exactly those mean. Similarly, if one wishes to live in Eretz Yisrael, one would have to accept not the Torah. However, one would have to accept the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and this is the status of a ger toshav in order to be allowed to live there fully as a citizen. Someone who didn't accept the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, if they were members of the nations of Canaan, who were considered to be completely corroded and a terrible pagan lifestyle with awful practices of child sacrifice and passing children through fire, Pamonef, and other such things, such a person wouldn't be allowed to stay in the lands of Eretz Yisrael at all, unless they accepted the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, whereas other non-Jews would be allowed to stay, but wouldn't have full citizenship rights unless they accepted the Sheva Noachide commandments and became a ger toshav. What are these 7 Noachide commandments? Very basic: don't murder, don't steal, don't worship idols, immorality, a system of law. We don't even define which system of law. There has to be a fair and ethical system of justice. It doesn't have to be our system of justice, but it has to be an equitable, reasonable system of justice. Avoidance of the most extreme form of cruelty to animals, very basic system or set of beliefs, and that would be enough for Yishuv, for being allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is a ger toshav. The Rambam actually defines 5 categories of non-Jew in halachic terms. Those who don't accept the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach at all, pagans, effectively. Those who accept it but haven't made a formal declaration of status in the Beis Din, who are called b'nei Noach. Those who have made a formal declaration of status, who are known as gerei toshav, a ger toshav, not a ger tzedek, not someone who has joined the Jewish people, but a different sort of ger, a ger toshav, someone who has become a stranger, a ger, but toshav, who has become a resident of the land of Israel. And then the Rambam talks about 2 more categories, which we're going to look at now. Chasidei umas ha'olam, the righteous amongst the Gentiles, and chachameha, the wise amongst the Gentiles. So these are 5 terms that the Rambam talks about in his 8th chapter of Hilchos Melachim, the laws of kings. Now, the particular text I want to have a look at is in Perek Ches, the 8th chapter, Halacha Yud Aleph, Halacha 11. And there the Rambam speaks about someone who accepts the commandments of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei. He isn't there discussing this in the context of someone who accepts it in court to achieve the status of a Ger Toshav, but just in terms of the inner life of the person, whether they accept to do it in terms of themselves. I should mention, by the way, there's a halachic debate about whether nowadays we can or cannot accept Gerei Toshav, and this is a matter of practical halachic consideration in the state of Israel, where, as we are aware, there are many non-Jewish residents to the land. This both includes Muslim or Arab inhabitants of the land of Israel, some of whom are very interested in Judaism but don't want to become Jewish, but are happy to accept Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei. And then the recent wave of, recent in the last couple of decades, of mass former Soviet Union immigrants, again, some of whom are not halachically Jewish, and therefore not obliged to accept to become Jews, they don't have to, but nonetheless, some of whom wish to become Gerei Toshav, they're influenced by Judaism and interested in it. There are also some of these Christian groups I mentioned, particularly in America, who are interested in the idea of becoming Gerei Toshav. So this is something that's discussed in practical halachic literature, whether it is or isn't applicable nowadays, and if it is, how to do it. Be that as it may, the Rambam in 8th chapter of the Laws of Kings, Hilchos Melachim, Halacha Yud Aleph, Halacha 11, discusses the inner life of someone who accepts belief, and he says, "Kol makabel Sheva Mitzvahs, anyone who accepts the 7 commandments, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei, the nizhar la'asoson, and is careful to do them. They are from the righteous of the Gentile nations, of the nations of the world. Such a person has a portion in the world to come." So far, so good. A Gentile who accepts the 7 Noachide commandments, they're doing that which they're meant to do, and therefore they have a portion in the world to come. And now the Rambam adds a couple more lines, which are notoriously difficult to understand, and no one really knows what he means. And he carries on and he says, "This is only if a person accepts them and does them, because God commanded them in the Torah. And we were taught by Moshe that the Bnei Noach commanded in these 7 Noachide commandments. If such a person did this through their own reason, this is not a Ger Toshav, and is not from the righteous of the nations of the world, and not from their wise ones. So here we see the various terms used. Someone who accepts the 7 Noachide commandments, but does so out of reason, as opposed to out of belief in the giving of the Torah, is not a Ger Toshav, not a Chasidei Umas Olam, not one of the righteous of the world, and not even a Chacham, a wise person. Before we try and analyze this, I'll also mention that there is a variant text in the Rambam, possibly a more accurate version, in which rather than it saying a person who doesn't accept the 7 Noachide commandments because of the Torah, but just from their own reason, is not a Ger Toshav, not a righteous Gentile, and not a wise person, the alternative version is, but a wise person. So they are not a Ger Toshav, they are not Chasidei Umas Olam from the righteous of the generations, but they are a wise person. In the Hebrew, this involves a very small shift of a Vav to an Aleph. So instead of it saying, V'lo michachameim, they are not from the wise, it would say, Elo michachameim, but from the wise. So these are 2 variant texts, and probably the latter, in which he says, but from the wise, is the more accurate Girsa according to the better quality manuscripts. So in brief, what do we have over here? We have a Rambam that says the following 3 points. Point number 1, anyone who accepts the 7 Noachide commandments is from the righteous of the Gentiles, and has a portion to the world to come. Point number 2 is that this is only if they accept it because they understand that this was commanded to us by Moshe at Sinai. And point number 3 is if they don't accept it for that reason, then they are not Chasidei, nor wise people or but wise people. So they're not from the righteous of the Gentiles, but they are from the Chachamim, or not even from the Chachamim. Now, this Rambam is enormously problematic and enormously difficult. First of all, what does this mean when he says that one is only considered from the righteous of the people of the world if one accepts the Noachide commandments because they were commanded at Sinai? He seems to be implying, perhaps he says this explicitly, that if someone through their own reason is philosophically minded and comes to the conclusion that they should believe in God, they shouldn't serve idols, they should set up a just and moral society, they shouldn't engage in immorality in terms of their relationships, they shouldn't engage in avim and achai, and eating a limb off a living animal, etc., etc. In one reading of what he's saying such a person hasn't achieved any spiritual status at all, because they don't do so because of belief in Torah and Moshe. It's only considered a significant act if they believe and do this because of belief in the Torah of Moshe. Now, this is difficult both in terms of equity and justice, and difficult in terms of being consistent with the view of the Rambam himself. How so? Well, two things. First of all, it would mean that anyone who happens not to have heard about the giving of the Torah, the story of Moshe, has no chance of becoming a Chassid Yom Olam and of acquiring a portion in the world to come, according to how we might be tempted to read the Rambam. This is very difficult. A human who lives far off, out of contact with the center of civilization, someone who lives in Central America 600 years ago, belongs to the Aztec or Inca Empire, has no chance for any deep and genuine spiritual life in this reading. If we understand that someone who arrives at these matters through their own philosophical speculation can also achieve true spirituality, then we understand the equity of the system. We have a human being. Maybe not everyone bothers achieving this, but at least in principle, every human can use their own reason to arrive at some truths of belief. And perhaps we can relate to this. But the Rambam here seems to be saying that every one of the Ummah Olam has to know about the revelation at Sinai in order to count as a believer. The second difficulty over here is that this is very problematic in terms of consistency with the Rambam's own views. The Rambam is passionately of the view of the value of philosophy, of human reason, of human achieved insight. The Rambam speaks very highly about the role of the Greek philosophers and so on and so forth. Now, the Rambam certainly understands that a Jewish person has to keep the Torah and dedicates a lot of his work to Mona Vuchim, of describing the spiritual impact of keeping Torah mitzvahs. Of course, this is something absolutely essential. But how can the Rambam, of all people, negate the philosophical quest and say that it is only worthwhile, one's only achieved any spiritual status if one believes in the revelation of Sinai? So this is really why this variant reading of the Rambam in his text is so crucial, because there are two ways now to read the Rambam. In version number one, the Rambam is saying indeed that someone who doesn't believe in that doesn't keep the seven Noachide, or someone who keeps the seven Noachide commandments, but only does so because of their own speculation, is not a Ger Toshav, not a Chassid, a righteous person, and not a Chacham, which is very difficult to understand. Whereas in the alternative version, the Rambam is saying they are not a Ger Toshav because they haven't formally accepted the status in Beis Din, in the Jewish Beis Din, where they understand that this is part of being the Jewish people. They are not from the Chassidim, but they are from Chachamel. And the Rambam may well be of the view that being a Chacham, being a wise person, is a genuine spiritual state and genuine spiritual status, and therefore certainly someone who can have a portion in the world to come. In fact, this seems most consistent with the view of the Rambam, who understands that philosophical belief is an important component of a spiritual life. And therefore, if we can go with a text which says Elo michachamel, but from those who are wise, then we understand better what the Rambam is saying, in which case he may be saying this isn't a Ger Toshav, but he doesn't mean to exclude such a person from the world to come. If the Rambam has the version of Lo michachamel, then perhaps he's only referring to a particular sort of individual, someone who keeps the Sheva Mitzvahs enough, not out of any genuine spiritual search and meaning, but simply because they understand this is a practical and convenient way to live. In other words, there are reasons for being moral beyond the general commitment to morality. For example, the social contract theory. In other words, it may make sense to be moral because if I agree not to steal from you, you would agree not to steal from me, and therefore we'll both be able to get on with our lives and succeed and flourish. In the Rambam's thinking, as in, I think probably the thinking of all Jewish thinkers, this isn't a genuine commitment to morality. This is simply an understanding that this is a practical way to live. It's not ascribing a real spiritual and moral value to doing that which is right because it's right. If I am merely kind and considerate because this is what I'm paid to do in my job, or I'm merely kind and considerate because I understand this is the practical way to live, that you'll be kind back to me, that's also effectively a form of payment. This isn't a genuine commitment to moral values, and therefore it may well be that the Rambam sees this as meaningless and empty, and that may be the impact of what the Rambam is saying. Most people, the fact is, that don't go around murdering, don't go around stealing, are committed to not doing so. Most people are committed to a life of relationship morality. Most people aren't going to engage in the most extreme and cruel acts of barbaric treatment of animals. Most are going to understand we need to set up a system of a court and justice. And therefore, the point that I'm saying over here is this is merely a pragmatic lifestyle choice, because this is a reasonable way to live if you want to have a convenient life, but this isn't a genuine commitment to morality and spirituality, and therefore the Rambam labels such a person as not being a chassid, not being a gertoshev, and not being mechachomel. This isn't genuinely buying into morality and spirituality because one sees it as having its own worth. It's just a practical form of running society and a social contract. So in brief, we have three readings of the Rambam. Reading number one, which is certainly the simplest reading in the Rambam according to our text, is that the Rambam is saying one is only considered a Noachite as a portion of the world to come if one accepts the Sheva Mitzvahs in Noach because of Matan Torah. However, this is difficult and inconsistent with the view of the Rambam elsewhere, and therefore it would appear that one of the two alternative second and third readings are correct. Either the Rambam is saying such a person is a Chacham, and therefore even higher than a regular Chassid, or the Rambam is saying that it depends which sort of reason gets you to live a moral life. Is it a reason because one genuinely commits to spirituality and morality, in which case the person certainly is an elevated individual, or is it just because it's a pragmatic way to live life, in which case there's no true spiritual content to this? I just want to conclude this this part of the series with one final set of remarks, and I know we're going to touch over time. I just want a few minutes. I started a little late, just to finish off this topic, so that next week we can move on to a new issue, which is perhaps the last part of the question I was asked in that text that I received this week, in which someone said to me, this whole subject is just so painful. And the question is, to what degree is any of this relevant to us? Meaning to say, this is all interesting philosophical talk. It may be something we worry about in terms of our own spiritual life. What happens if we know that we have doubts or hesitations or ups and downs or sometimes wobble in our belief? Is this important for us to know in terms of our own spiritual life? But is there anything more to this? Why is this a discussion in a halachic sense at all? Is this a discussion where the normal rules of halacha should apply? Now, I do want to give a series at some point in light of the questions about what halacha is and how psak halacha works. I think it's a very important topic to cover. But for now, I'll just make several comments. The first is we have seen enough sources to determine that if one wobbles in one's own faith, if one has ups and downs, if one sometimes questions and so on, one need not assume that one is in the category of a kofar, a heretic, God forbid. And this is absolutely clear in the writings of, as I said, a vast array of senior poskim across the Hashkafic divide, from the Chazon Ish through to Rav Shlomo Goren, through to Rav Kook, through to Rav Dov Tzvi Hoffman, a vast array of poskim who say that we shouldn't, God forbid, assume that we are somehow excluded because we perhaps engage in a lifelong quest to engage meaningfully with belief. Number one. Number two, having said that, it's pretty important to continue to engage in this quest and not to allow oneself to, chas v'shalom, end up not being a believer. It's certainly the correct thing to do. The third point to make is that, at least in principle, these are matters of halachic consideration, and therefore these topics are brought in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch does pass on some of these, because at the end of the day, someone who would be determined halachically to be a kofar, with all the limits that we've discussed, and as we said, it's all but not a status that it would be applied nowadays. Nonetheless, such a person does lose some of their rights as a member of the Jewish people, and may end up as someone who cannot easily be given an aliyah l'Torah, or viewed as a valid witness in certain sorts of court cases and the like. There are halachic implications if someone loses their status, their Jewish status, to some degree or other, and these are subjects that hit the media every so often, in terms of some of the sensitive issues around giving people the right to be called up to the Torah and the like, but that's really a further discussion. However, I do not believe it is correct to say that this is a matter for which there should be no halachic discussion at all. There are those who claim that since this is a matter of hashkafa, of a worldview rather than practical halacha, why should psak halacha, why should the halachic system have anything to say about this? And this doesn't appear to be correct, since there are, at least in theory, halachic implications for all of this, as I'll try to share how in practice the poskim have limited this to an extreme. So that concludes really what I wanted to speak about in terms of the place in Olam Haba of non-believers and non-Jews. We absolutely believe that a non-Jew who lives in the basic level of commitment has a chedek in Olam Haba. The concept of tinit shenishba could well apply there. Also, it doesn't seem to be a reason it shouldn't apply also to the non-Jewish category. I will move on though next week to different topics, and I do have a list of big questions that people want me to cover. If anyone wants to put forward a particular topic, please email me this week. This is your chance to do so before we start the next mini-series. And in the meantime, I'll just pause in case anyone has questions. Otherwise, I'll stop for this week.
Sorry, Rabbi, can I just check with the equivalent of a tinok shenishba for a non-Jew, which you didn't, I know, equate it in that way. So someone who lives a very moral life but doesn't actually think about Sheba Mitzvahs and they know because they never learnt them, they've never heard of them, but de facto they live in a they do all the things that would be covered by the Sheba Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, except for one assumes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to the Bnei Israel at Har Sinai because they wouldn't know about that. Are we saying they'd have a place in the world to come? There's nothing intellectual about what they're doing. It's just they are nice people, to use a banal phrase. Are we saying they would have a place in the world to come?
Without the category of tinok shenishba, no, they wouldn't, according to the formulation of the Rambam. However, there doesn't seem to be an obvious reason why the concept of tinok shenishba shouldn't apply there also. Since the idea of tchias hamesim would appear to apply to all human beings, and since, unless one falls in the category of a heretic, and since we saw that the Rambam says someone who has been brought up unaware of the alternative viewpoint is not a heretic, and we've seen that the post can extend this and say nowadays in this confusing Holocaust world within which we live, post-Holocaust world, and with the spirituality so blurred, no one falls in that category. I can't see a reason why that should differ with a Jew or a non-Jew, and therefore the presumption would be such a person could have a portion in the world to come.
Thank you.
And Rabbi, can I just ask then, for those who don't get a place in the world to come, non-Jew and Jew, where do they go? What do we believe happens?
Okay, so here you get to a divide between the Kabbalists and the Rambam. The Rambam is of the view that if someone has no spiritual life whatsoever, if they've emptied themselves of any spiritual life, then they have no spiritual existence. There's nothing left for them to exist. It'd be a bit like asking, what is the spiritual life of a frog or an animal that has no inner consciousness that we understand. I don't know much about frogs' inner lives, but assuming a very basic animal has no inner consciousness at all, then what is there for them to exist once their physical body cease? Whenever the Rambam would say such a person has no inner consciousness at all. As we've seen already, the poskim adopt the view that this wouldn't apply to anyone nowadays in today's confusing world. But in principle, were we to find an individual who had rid themselves of any spiritual content, the Rambam would be of the view that they would simply cease to exist. They wouldn't have any spiritual life. They don't have a spiritual life. The Kabbalists take a different view. They believe that everyone has an inner core of spirituality from which a person can be reconstructed and rebuilt. And therefore, when we talk about someone not having a portion to the world to come, we simply mean that they don't have an apparent and visible and obvious portion, but eventually out of the skeleton spirituality that is left to them, they will be reconstructed into their into a spiritual form. Okay, so I'll stop there for today, and I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for joining. If this has left anyone deeply troubled, please do speak to me afterwards or WhatsApp me. As I said, I know a number of you were a little disturbed by this, and I understand that. And I wish you all well.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.